Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and very grateful for the invitation. My talk is a response to inquiries about what is my view about action research, which I've been involved in for the last, I should think, 40 years. Now, there are many different versions of action research, and I'm going to argue that the action research that I have been associated with is of an ethically informed inquiry. So I will press a button and see if I can get to my first slide. Right. Oh, it doesn't quite come up properly here. Oh. Can somebody help me, because everything is not coming up on the screen for me. Maybe I must go and get some paper copies of my... Is it? But no. I'd better go and get... No? Oh, I can turn around and look. Okay, thank you. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, I am going to be talking about educational action research, not action research generally. And the focus for the action research I'm going to talk about is teaching in schools and in classrooms and in universities. And I'm going to argue that the whole teachers as researchers movement in the UK that stems from the work of Lawrence Stenhouse the whole emphasis was on making teaching more educational. And it was connected with helping teachers to realize certain aims and values in their practice. So it was based on the assumption, well, it was based on the argument that teaching is a social practice. It's not simply a technology for engineering certain predefined learning outcomes that have high economic commodity value in society. Based on the view that teaching is a social practice and it's embedded in certain values and beliefs, embedded, if you like, in a professional culture. So intrinsic to teaching as a social practice are certain social ends that define an ideal form of life in society. Now, these social ends, they refer to values it is the teacher's task to realize through his or her interactions with learners in the classroom. And these ends, they set criteria for what is to count as an educationally worthwhile process of teaching and learning. So in other words, a task of action research is to realize the ends that define a worthwhile process, I emphasize process, of teaching and learning. I'm referring to the process, not to the consequences or the outcomes of the process. Because in education today, we are dominated by what is called outcomes-based education. And outcomes education ignores the view, neglects the view that teaching is a social practice, which is defined by certain values and beliefs about what is to count as a worthwhile educational process. Now, Stenhouse had a process model of curriculum planning and development. Now, I don't know very much about the curriculum framework in Kazakhstan, but Stenhouse's view was the important thing about the process model was it was the quality of the educational process that the child was engaged in the learning environment, in the school, in the classroom, that was very, very important. And he became an articulate critic of the outcome-based behavioral objectives model of curriculum planning. That was called, and still is called, rational curriculum planning. So the curriculum was planned to achieve certain pre-specifiable learning outcomes. Now again, Stenhouse argued for a process model that defined what was a worthwhile educational process. So yes, it was important to specify the curriculum content, but the important thing was, how does a teacher interact with the student in relationship to that content? It was that process by which the teacher interacted with the students, interacting with the content, that was the very important, significant thing. So that the goals of teaching cannot be reduced to psychological and behavioral changes in individuals that are disconnected from the form of social life in which they are to be nurtured. And we will have heard this morning quite a lot about John Dewey. Well, that was precisely the argument of John Dewey. Now, just to look at the process model again, many innovatory pedagogical aims, and I heard some in the meeting I attended yesterday. For example, I believe that the curriculum language in Kazakhstan, in that part of that language, is the idea of learner-centered education, right? Now, I would call that innovatory pedagogical aim. Other examples I put up there: developing understanding, inquiry, discovery learning, independent, self-directed, autonomous learning, problem-based learning, learning through discussion. These are all aims that are raised in the context of curriculum reforms. And they are indicative of a movement in the wider social milieu towards a greater liberal democracy in our society. So in other words, I would argue that these aims actually refer to clusters of values that are about the democratization of the educational process. Now, Stenhouse was very quick to grasp that these aims implied a process model of curriculum design. As expressions of the social ends of education, these aims were to be analysed into principles of procedure governing the process of education rather than into pre-specified learning outcomes. So in other words, certain kinds of aims, like the ones that I have referred to, that are listed there, these aims, if you analyse them into principles governing the interaction between teachers and pupils in classrooms. You don't analyse them into more specific objectives. So in other words, very often when we talk about aims in education, we are not talking about outcomes. We are talking about the quality of the educational process. We are talking about the quality of the interactions between the pupils and between the teacher and the pupils in the classroom. Okay. Now, Dewey argued in 1897, we heard this morning that he died in, 1952? In 1897, he produced something called My Pedagogic Creed. And he argued that with the advent of democracy, it is impossible to prepare the child for any set of conditions. In other words, we have to enable children to create, through the educational system, their own futures. We cannot spend enormous amounts of resources in a futile task, which is to create children's futures for them when our society are being globalized, changing, and so on and so forth. So this requires great pedagogical adjustment, and it calls for the constant regard to the cultivation of the individual's own powers, tastes, and interests. So aims and procedural principles orientate teaching to the cultivation of these powers that you need children to acquire in a democratic society. And Stenhouse believed that the acquisition of these powers was incompatible with a technological approach to teaching that was entirely focused on the production of measurable learning outcomes. So, I'm hoping to give people some food for thought, because the realization of the procedural values implicit in the social ends of education require a great deal of innovation by teachers as they attempt to transform prevailing cultures of teaching and learning in the light of them. We have made a terrible mistake by assuming that teachers could simply take these aims of education that I have referred to and implement them. No problem whatsoever. Just let the teachers get on with it in the classroom. Well, I've had numerous teachers, for example, say to me, John, come into my classroom because I'm having a discussion with the children. And I want you to observe this discussion. And I will sit there and I think, where is the discussion? What I observe is question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. Is that a discussion? No, it's not a discussion. So, learner-centered education. I worked on educational reforms in post-independence Namibia some years some years being more learner-centered. And of course they didn't. Because what needs to be unpacked is what are the values and the principles that are embedded in these educational goals. And then the task of the teacher is to try to find ways of realizing these values and the principles in forms of transformative action in their classroom. Now, even if I haven't got time to say anything else this afternoon, the action research tradition that started in Britain, I'm not saying action research started in Britain, it didn't. There is a German form of action research, there is an American form of action research, and interestingly, both those forms of action research were attempts to transform the academic discipline of the social sciences. So they were an attempt to reconstruct a university discipline to make it more relevant to practice. But the action research that started in Britain with the work of Stenhouse was focused not on transforming the social sciences and making it more relevant to practice. It was focused on realizing certain educational values that reflected significant movements in the social milieu, in realizing them in practice, in the classroom situation. And that needed a great deal of systematic reflection, thought, evidence gathering on the part of teachers. So that was what action research was. It was, if you like, an ethically informed methodology of inquiry, and it was very consistent with the pragmatist philosophical tradition that we heard about this morning of John Dewey. So, now in the United States of America, Stenhouse pointed out there was an interesting example of the process model of curriculum design, and that was Jerome Bruner's elementary school social science curriculum called Manor Course of Study. Now, I don't have time to spell out all the principles or pedagogical aims, as they were called, that structured the design of Manor Course of Study, the elementary social science curriculum that John Dewey created. Sorry, not John Dewey, Jerome Bruner. But you can see there, I've just put up a few of the principles of procedure that govern the design of that curriculum. Now, Stenhouse argued the problem there was teachers were not supported to undertake action research into the realization of those principles, those pedagogical aims in action. And because the teachers were not enabled to undertake action research into how they realize these principles in action, eventually Manor Course of Study basically faded away in the American elementary school. Now, I'm just going to very briefly mention two examples of a process model of curriculum design that formed the basis for two big action research projects. One was the Humanities Project, And it was a very good example of taking an aim, and which was the development of understanding of human situations and actions and the controversial issues they raised in society. And what Stenhouse then did was he analysed that aim into a number of procedural principles. For example, teachers should not use their authority as teachers as a platform for promoting their own views in the classroom. That the mode of inquiry in controversial issues should have discussion rather than instruction at its core. That the discussion should protect divergence of view amongst the participants, and that the teacher should have responsibility for quality and standards in learning. Now then, Stenhouse argued, those principles can only be realised if the teacher takes on the role of a researcher in the classroom. And one of my jobs, when I was appointed onto this project, was helping the teachers to carry out research in their classrooms. And these were teachers all over England, in what we call the experimental schools. And we got teachers not only doing research in their individual classrooms, but coming together at conferences and seminars, comparing their data with one another and coming up with certain hypotheses about how do you realise these values in action in the particular settings in which we teach. So, a knowledge base was built about how you realise these principles for the teaching of controversial issues in classrooms and schools. And the teachers collaboratively constructed this knowledge base that then has been systematically ignored for many years. So teachers still go on about how do we teach controversial issues? Well, once upon a time, teachers got together, gathered data, compared and contrasted each other's experience, and generated some fairly general insights into strategies for realising these procedural principles in order to foster and develop the children's understanding in the classroom. And yet, people go on, still today, reinventing the wheel, not using the findings of that project as a platform on which to build and keep developing their knowledge and understanding of the teaching of controversial situations and actions in our society.
Dear Professor John Elliot.
I've got 5 minutes.
Yeah,
thank you. I have learned from experience. Now, I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples of these hypotheses. That Stenhouse thought that teachers would take hypotheses too much as a prescription of what to do. So he produced a handbook, and we got teachers to gather data, whether it was video data, whether it was audio data, whether it was interviews with the students, to gather the data and to ask themselves some questions. To what extent do you interrupt students when they are speaking? Why? And to what effect? Reflective discussion can often be slow-paced and contain sustained silences. What proportion of these silences are interrupted by you? The students can use silence as a weapon to make the teacher take over the task they should face as a group. Do you pressurize towards consensus? For example, do you say a lot in your classroom? Do we all agree with what Sydney has just said? What effect does that have? Because what we found was that when the teacher said that, there was total silence in the classroom. And eventually, a child said, yes, we agree, and that was the end. That was the end of it. Well, why don't you change your behaviour and say, does anyone disagree with that? Does that have a different effect? So, through the action research, teachers, if you like, were engaged in a process of trying to actually transform the classroom situation into one that was consistent with the values and the principles embodied in the aim. That was what action research used to be about, and still is about in many countries, even though it may be difficult to find sometimes in the UK. And just to finish, I'm going to give you just one more example of a project that was across the curriculum, looking at some of these general aims, and this was a project about implementing the aim of inquiry teaching in the classroom. And what we did is this is just some examples, 2 examples of this project, which involved something like 25 schools with groups of teachers in each school. So this kind of action research I'm talking about was not small scale. It came up with general insights, general hypotheses for other teachers then to use as a platform to carry on testing and carry on developing the knowledge base. But I'll just give you an example. We had a procedural principle in this project that was called students should have the freedom to express ideas and develop lines of inquiry in the classroom. And that implied the procedural principles refrain from preventing students expressing their own ideas and developing lines of inquiry, and help students to develop their own ideas and lines of inquiry. Right, how do you realise those principles in the classroom? Well, the teachers came up with this. Sorry, I will finish in a moment. There we are. When the teachers, this is something that the teachers came up with. When the teachers' questions focused the students' attention solely on the subject matter, rather than on their own ideas about it, he or she may prevent them from initiating or developing their own ideas. Such focusing will be interpreted by the students as an attempt to find out whether they know what he or she, the teacher, knows. Now, that came out of teachers interacting with students, talking with them, and the students would say, well, the trouble is, when you ask us this kind of question, we think you're just trying to find out whether we know what you know, and you're not really interested in our thinking. And so this meant that the teachers started suggesting refrain from framing your questions in terms which draw attention exclusively to the subject matter, rather than to the students' thoughts about the subject matter. Now, these may seem to be very trivial little details, but what I'm saying is they came out, the findings of teachers' collaborative action research together, and through these details, teachers constructed a knowledge base, a platform of professional knowledge which other teachers could then take forward, test out further, and keep on developing. That was the idea of action research. So, just to finish, action research became the British version, what is called the pragmatic British model, which of course probably cannot be found too much in Britain today. But you can find it going in other parts of the world as educational ideas globalise. But it was really about how do teachers, if you like, transform the process of teaching and learning in the classroom in ways that is consistent with certain educational values. And if you look at those educational values, they reflect a social movement in the wider social milieu towards greater liberal democratic form of life. Right, thank you very much.